The sea was calm, but his mind was not. He stood alone near the edge of the island, looking out at the wide blue water. The wind moved gently across the surface, and small waves touched the shore again and again. It looked peaceful. Anyone watching him from far away would think he had accepted his fate. But inside him, there was a storm that never stopped. Not long ago, he had ruled over much of Europe. Kings feared him. Armies followed him with loyalty and pride. His name alone was enough to change the mood of a battlefield. But now, everything had changed. After a series of hard battles and a final defeat, he had been forced to give up his power. The man who once controlled nations was now sent away to a small island called Elba. It was not a prison in chains, but it was still a prison in its own way. The island was small, quiet, and far from the world he once knew. At first, life there seemed almost normal. He was allowed to stay in a comfortable house. He even had a small group of soldiers with him. He was given control over the island's local matters, as if he were still a ruler, but only of this tiny piece of land. Every morning, he woke up early. Old habits did not leave him. He walked through the streets, spoke to local people, and gave orders to improve roads and buildings. He tried to stay busy. He told himself that this was his new life now. But no matter how much he tried, something always felt missing. Sometimes, he would stop in the middle of his work and stare into the distance. His mind would go back to the past. He would remember the sound of marching armies, the noise of drums, the feeling of standing at the front of thousands of men who trusted him completely. Those memories were both powerful and painful. The people on the island respected him. Some even admired him. But they did not truly understand who he was. To them, he was just a fallen leader living among them. They did not see the fire that still burned inside him. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, news from outside slowly reached the island. Ships would arrive, bringing supplies and stories. France was not doing well. The new king who had taken power was struggling. Many people were unhappy. Taxes were high and trust was low. Soldiers felt forgotten. They missed the days when they fought with pride under a leader they believed in. These stories caught his attention. At first, he listened quietly. He did not react much. But inside, something began to grow. A thought, a question. Was his story really over? At night, he would sit alone, sometimes with a map in front of him. His fingers would move slowly across it, tracing the shape of France, the roads, the cities. His eyes would focus deeply, as if he could see beyond the paper. He started asking more questions when ships arrived. Not directly, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but carefully. He wanted to know about the army, about the people, about the mood in the country. The answers were always the same. People were not happy. That thought stayed with him. One evening, as the sun began to set, he walked along the shore again. The sky was painted in soft orange and red colors. It should have been a beautiful moment, but his face was serious. He stopped and looked at the horizon. Somewhere beyond that water was his country, his people, his past, and maybe his future. From that day on, something changed. He became more alert, more focused. He still did his daily work, but his mind was somewhere else. He began to observe everything around him more carefully. He watched the ships that came and went. He noticed the guards, their routines, their habits. He paid attention to the timing of everything, the tides, the weather, the movement of people. Nothing escaped his eyes. To others, it seemed like he was simply living his quiet life. But in truth, he was studying his surroundings like a man preparing for something important. Because he was. He knew that if he ever wanted to leave the island, it would not be easy. The world believed he was dangerous. They would not let him go freely. If he tried and failed, the consequences would be severe. There would be no second chance. That made his thinking even sharper. He also knew something else. Even if he managed to leave the island, that would only be the beginning. Returning to France would be far more dangerous. He would not have a large army waiting for him. He would be walking into uncertainty. But still, the idea did not leave him. Instead, it grew stronger each day. Some nights, he could not sleep. He would walk inside his room, back and forth, thinking deeply. His mind would play out different possibilities. What if he succeeded? What if he failed? What if no one supported him? Every path had risks. But doing nothing also had a cost. It meant accepting this quiet life forever. It meant letting his story end here, on this small island, far away from everything that once defined him. That thought was harder to accept than any risk. One afternoon, he called a few of his most trusted men. These were soldiers who had stayed loyal to him even after his fall. They had followed him through difficult times, and they understood him better than most. They sat together in a private room. He did not speak immediately. He looked at each of them, one by one, as if measuring their thoughts. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. He asked them a simple question. If there was a chance, would you take it? The room became quiet. The men looked at each other, then back at him. They understood what he was asking, even though he had not said it directly. One of them nodded slowly. Another leaned forward and said, "We have always followed you." There was no need for long speeches. Trust was already there. That moment was important. It was a first step from thought to action. After that, the planning became more real. They began to talk in low voices, making sure no one else could hear. They discussed possible ways to leave the island. They thought about ships, routes, timing. Everything had to be perfect. Even one small mistake could destroy everything. Days passed, and their plans slowly took shape. They chose the right moment carefully. They needed a time when attention would be low, when movement would not raise suspicion. Every detail mattered, even the smallest one. During this time, he remained calm on the outside. He continued his routine as usual. He spoke to people, gave orders, and showed no sign of what was happening behind the scenes. But inside, his focus was sharper than ever. The quiet island that once felt like an ending was now becoming the starting point of something new. The sea was no longer just a barrier. It was a path, and he was getting ready to take it. As another sunset approached, he stood once again by the shore. But this time, his eyes were different. There was no confusion in them, no doubt, only determination. The world believed his story was finished, but he was preparing to prove them wrong. The night was darker than usual, as if the sky itself was hiding what was about to happen. The island was quiet. Most people were asleep, unaware that history was about to change again. The soft sound of the sea filled the air, steady and calm. But beneath that calm surface, something bold was unfolding. He moved carefully through the shadows, not in a rush, but with purpose. Every step was planned. Every movement was controlled. A few trusted men followed him closely. No one spoke. There was no need for words now. They had talked enough. This was the moment. Near the shore, a small ship waited. It did not look special, just another vessel resting by the water. But tonight, it carried more than men. It carried a risk that could change everything. Before stepping onto the ship, he paused for a second. His eyes moved across the island, the same land where he had spent months thinking, waiting, planning. For a brief moment, it felt strange to leave behind. Then he turned away. There was no hesitation now. He stepped onto the ship, and one by one, the others followed. The ropes were loosened. The sail was raised slowly, carefully, so no sudden movement would draw attention. The ship began to drift away from the shore. At first, everything was silent, only the sound of water moving gently against the sides of the ship. As the distance from the island grew, a quiet tension filled the air. Every man on board knew the danger. If they were seen too soon, everything would end right here. Far away, powerful forces still watched the sea. Ships move across these waters, guarding, observing. If one of them noticed this small vessel, there would be no escape. He stood near the front of the ship, looking ahead into the darkness. His face was calm, but his mind was active. He thought about the journey ahead, about what waited for him across the sea. France. The name alone carried weight. Behind him, one of his men spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Do you think they will accept us?" He did not turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on the horizon, then answered quietly, "They will remember." That was all he said. The journey was not easy. The sea was not always kind. As the hours passed, the wind grew stronger. Waves began to rise, pushing against the ship with force. The small vessel moved up and down, shaking under the pressure. Some of the men struggled to keep their balance. Others held tightly to ropes and wood, trying to stay steady. But he remained standing. He had faced storms before, on land and at sea. This was just another challenge. The real danger was not the waves. It was being found. During the day, they stayed alert. Every shadow on the water, every distant shape, made their hearts beat faster. A ship on the horizon could mean safety or the end. At times, they changed their direction slightly, trying to avoid known paths. They did not want attention. They wanted to disappear into the open sea. Food was simple. Sleep was limited. No one fully rested. Even when their eyes closed, their minds stayed awake. Time felt strange during the journey. Hours felt long and nights felt even longer. But slowly, day by day, they moved closer to their destination. Then, one morning, something changed. A man at the side of the ship suddenly pointed ahead. Land! All eyes turned in the same direction. There it was, the coast. A quiet but powerful feeling spread across the ship. Relief, hope, and tension all at once. They had made it across the sea. But the hardest part was just beginning. As they moved closer to shore, everything had to be done carefully. They could not arrive like conquerors. They were not strong enough for that. They needed to be smart. The ship reached land quietly. No loud movements. No signals. Just a careful arrival, as if they were not meant to be noticed. He stepped onto the ground slowly. For the first time since his exile, he stood on French soil again. He looked down for a moment, as if feeling the land beneath his feet. Then he looked up. There was no celebration, no cheering crowd, just silence and uncertainty. He knew this. He had expected it. Behind him stood only a small group of loyal men. No large army. No guarantee of support. Just belief. They began to move inland, walking along quiet paths and small roads. Villages passed by slowly. Some people noticed them. Some stared in surprise. Others whispered among themselves. The news had not spread yet, but it would. As they continued forward, tension grew. At any moment, soldiers could appear. Orders would already be moving through the country. The king would not ignore this. And soon enough it happened. Ahead of them, a group of royal soldiers blocked the road. They stood in formation, armed and ready. Their faces were serious. They had one clear purpose: to stop him. The men behind him became alert. Some held their weapons tighter. The situation could turn in seconds. But he raised his hand slightly. A signal. No one moved. He stepped forward alone, slowly, calmly. The distance between him and the soldiers grew smaller with each step. The air felt heavy. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. The soldiers watched him closely. Their weapons were ready. One wrong move, and everything could end here. But he did not stop. He walked closer until he stood clearly in front of them. Then, in a steady voice, he spoke. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply reminded them. He spoke of the past, of the battles they had fought together, of the pride they once carried, of the bond between a leader and his soldiers. His words were simple, but they carried weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, something changed. One soldier slowly lowered his weapon. Another looked at the man beside him, unsure. A third took a step forward, not in attack, but in recognition. The tension began to break. He stood there, still calm, still confident. "I am here," he said softly. "If you wish to stop me, you may." But no one moved against him. Instead, one by one, the soldiers began to step forward, not as enemies, but as followers. The moment was quiet, but powerful. The risk he had taken, the journey across the sea, the uncertainty, it had all led to this. And now, something impossible was becoming real. The small group that had landed on the shore was growing. What started as a dangerous escape was turning into something much bigger. As they continued their march, more eyes watched them. More voices whispered. The story was spreading. He had returned. And this time, he was not alone. The night he left the island had been silent. But now, the world was beginning to listen. The road ahead stretched far into the distance. But now it no longer felt empty. When he first stepped onto the land, he had only a few men with him. The air was filled with doubt and risk. Every step could have been his last. But now, things were changing. The small group walking behind him was growing. At first, it was just a few soldiers who joined after that quiet moment on the road. They had once stood ready to stop him. But something in his voice, something in his presence, reminded them of the past. They chose to follow him instead. As they moved from one place to another, more people began to notice. Villagers stood near their doors, watching in silence. Some looked confused. Others whispered softly. A few stepped closer, try and see his face clearly, as if they could not believe what they were seeing. "Is it really him?" one man asked quietly. "It cannot be," another replied, though his eyes stayed fixed on the figure walking ahead. But it was him. There was no doubt. He did not rush. He did not try to hide. He walked openly, calmly, as if he belonged there. That quiet confidence made people think, made them question what they had been told. Word began to spread. At first, it moved slowly, like a small ripple in water, but soon it grew faster. Messengers carried the news. Travelers shared the story. By the time he reached the next town, people were already waiting. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with hope. He stopped often, speaking to small groups. His words were not long or complicated. He spoke simply, directly. He reminded them of the past, not with pride, but with honesty. He spoke about the times when the country felt strong, when soldiers returned home with honor, when people believed in something bigger than themselves. Many listened in silence. Some nodded slowly. Others stepped forward and joined. The march continued. Each day, the group became larger. Soldiers who had once worn different uniforms now walked together. Some still looked unsure, but they stayed. They watched him closely, trying to understand if this was real or just a passing moment. But as the days passed, their doubt began to fade. They saw how he moved, how he spoke, how he looked at them, not as tools, but as people. That made a difference. Meanwhile, far away in the capital, the news arrived like a shock. At first, it was dismissed. Impossible, some said. He is on the island. He cannot return. But then more reports came. He had landed. He was marching. Soldiers were joining him. Now it could not be ignored. The king sat in his palace, surrounded by advisors. The room was filled with tension. Messages were read again and again, as if repeating them would change the truth. "What should we do?" someone asked. No one answered immediately, because the truth was clear, even if no one wanted to say it. They were not ready. Orders were sent out quickly. More troops were told to move and stop him. But there was a problem. Those same troops had once served under him. And as the marching group moved closer to larger towns and cities, the same pattern repeated again and again. Soldiers were sent to block the path. He would step forward. He would speak. And slowly, the line between enemy and ally would disappear. It was not magic. It was memory. The soldiers remembered who they had followed before. They remembered the feeling of standing together under a leader they trusted. That feeling was stronger than fear. Back on the road, the march had become something much bigger than anyone had expected. It was no longer just a return. It was a movement. People walked alongside the soldiers now. Not all of them carried weapons. Some were simple workers, farmers, and travelers, but they walked with purpose. They wanted to be part of something. They wanted to see what would happen next. The closer they got to the capital, the faster the news spread. Cities ahead were already preparing, not with defense, but with questions. What would happen when he arrived? Would there be a battle? Would the streets turn into chaos? Or would something else happen? No one knew. One evening, the group stopped near a small town. The sun was setting, and the sky was filled with soft light. Fires were lit, and people gathered in small circles. He sat quietly for a moment, watching people around him. These were not just soldiers. They were people who had chosen to follow him again without force, without pressure. That thought stayed with him. One of his men sat beside him. "It is growing faster than we thought," the man said. He nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied, "but we must stay careful." Even now, he did not allow himself to feel too comfortable. He knew how quickly things could change. One wrong step, one wrong moment, could turn everything. But still, something was different now. The fear that once followed them had begun to fade. In its place, there was something stronger: belief. As night fell, the camp grew quiet, but in the distance, lights from the town still flickered. People were awake, talking, thinking. The whole country was beginning to feel it. A shift, a change. By the next morning, they were moving again. The road to the capital was now closer than ever. And ahead of them, the biggest moment was waiting. In the capital, the situation had become serious. The king could no longer ignore it. Reports confirmed what many feared. The army sent to stop him had failed. Not because they were weak, but because they had chosen not to fight. The support was slipping away. The palace, once filled with confidence, now felt uncertain. Some advised the king to stay and fight. Others suggested something else. Leave, one voice said quietly. At first, the idea seemed unthinkable. But as more news arrived, it began to make sense. If the army would not stand against him, then staying might only lead to capture. And so, a decision was made. It was quick, quiet, without public announcement. The king prepared to leave. Back on the road, he and his growing group moved forward, unaware of the exact moment, but feeling the change in the air. There were no more strong barriers ahead, no more serious resistance, only distance. And that distance was getting smaller with every step. Finally, one day, the city appeared in the distance, the capital, the place where everything had once begun, and where everything was about to begin again. The people walking with him slowed, slightly, as if they could feel the importance of the moment. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed forward. They simply moved together, step by step. What started as a quiet escape from an island had turned into a march that shook an entire nation. And now, standing at the edge of the capital, one truth had become clear. He had returned, not with force, but with something far more powerful. And the world was watching. The city did not welcome him with noise. It welcomed him with silence. When he finally entered the capital, there were no loud battles, no broken gates, no fire in the streets. Instead, there was something much deeper. People stood along the roads, watching him pass. Some looked amazed, some looked unsure, but many looked hopeful. He walked forward calmly, just as he had on every road before this one. The group behind him was now large, filled with soldiers and ordinary people. What started as a small return had become something powerful. Inside the city, everything had already changed. The king was gone. He had left quietly, without a fight, without a final stand. The palace, once full of control, now stood open and uncertain. As he stepped inside, there was no resistance, no guards trying to stop him, only empty halls and waiting eyes. In just a short time, he had taken back control. It felt almost unreal. From a small island far away to the center of power again, his journey had shocked everyone. Across Europe, leaders could not believe what had happened. They had thought his story was over. They had thought he was no longer a threat. But now he was back. And this time, they were not going to take chances. Messages began to move quickly between countries. Leaders spoke in urgent tones. They knew one thing clearly. If they did nothing, he might become strong again. So they made a decision. They would unite. Different countries with different goals came together for one purpose. They wanted to end his rule once and for all. They did not want another long struggle. They wanted a final answer. Back in the capital, he understood this. He knew they would not stay quiet. He knew time was limited. Even though he had returned without a fight, he could feel the pressure building. Every day mattered. Every decision had weight. He began to work immediately. He met with soldiers, leaders, and officials. He listened carefully, then gave clear orders. He wanted to rebuild strength quickly. The army needed to be ready. The country needed to stand together again. But things were not the same as before. Some people supported him strongly. They believed in him and trusted his leadership. Others were more careful. They had seen too much change, too much uncertainty. He noticed this. He knew he could not rely only on the past. He needed to act wisely in the present. Still, there was one clear path in front of him. He had to move before his enemies were fully prepared. If he waited too long, they would gather their forces and surround him. But if he acted quickly, he might have a chance to face them one by one. It was a risky plan, but he had always taken risks. Days passed quickly as preparations began. Soldiers trained. Supplies were gathered. Plans were made. The air in the city was different now. It was no longer quiet. It carried tension, like a storm waiting to arrive. One evening, he stood near a window, looking out over the city. Lights flickered in the distance. People moved through the streets, living their lives, unaware of how close they were to another turning point. A trusted officer stood nearby. "They are coming," the officer said softly. He nodded. "I know." There was no fear in his voice, only focus. The plan was simple in idea, but difficult in action. He would move north, where enemy forces were gathering. If he could strike early, he might break their plans before they could fully unite. Speed would be the key. Soon, the army began to move. Columns of soldiers marched out of the city, their steps steady and strong. The sound of movement filled the air once again, bringing back memories of earlier times. But this time, everything felt heavier, because this was not just another campaign. This was the last chance. As they moved forward, the mood among the soldiers was mixed. Some felt proud to be marching again. Others felt the weight of what was coming. They knew this would not be easy. Still, they followed, because they believed. Days later, they reached the areas where enemy forces were expected. The land was open, wide, and quiet. Too quiet. Reports came in. Enemy troops were close. More were on the way. The moment had arrived. The battlefield that would decide everything was near. He studied the situation carefully. Maps were spread out. Messengers came and went. Every detail mattered now. At first, there were small movements. Positions were taken. Lines were formed. Each side watched the other, waiting for the right moment. Then, slowly, the tension turned into action. The battle began. At the start, things went well. His plans worked. His soldiers moved with skill and confidence. There was energy in their steps, belief in their actions. It seemed possible. It seemed like he might win again. But battle is never simple. As time passed, small problems began to appear. Delays happened. Messages took longer to arrive. The ground was not easy to move across. And then, something more serious. Enemy forces that were not expected so soon began to arrive. Fresh troops. More numbers. The balance began to shift. He adjusted his plans quickly. Orders changed. Movements shifted. He tried to hold the advantage. But the situation was becoming harder. The energy that once pushed his army forward was now being tested. The enemy grew stronger with each passing hour. Still, he did not give up. He moved across the field, watching, thinking, directing. He had faced difficult moments before. He believed he could still turn around. But time was not on his side. As the day continued, the truth became clearer. The battle was slipping away. His soldiers were tired. The pressure was too strong. The numbers were too great. What had started with hope was now turning into struggle. Even then, he remained steady. He did not run. He did not panic. He stayed until the end, watching as the final moments played out. When it was over, the result was clear. This time, there would be no victory. The army began to pull back. The field grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not calm, but heavy. The last chance had been lost. As he stood there, looking over what remained, he understood what it meant. This was not like before. There would be no easy return, no second rise. The road ahead would lead somewhere very different. And deep down, he knew it. The journey that began with a bold escape had reached its hardest moment, and the end was now closer than ever. The air felt heavier after the battle, as if even the wind understood what had been lost. The field behind him was quiet now. The noise, the movement, the energy of the fight, all gone. What remained was silence, deep and hard to ignore. The kind of silence that makes a person think more than they want to. He did not rush away. For a moment, he stayed where he was, looking across the land. This was not the first time he had faced defeat. But this time, something felt different. Before, there had always been another chance, another path, another way to rise again. Now that feeling was gone. The men around him began to move slowly, pulling back, gathering what they could. Some looked tired, others confused. A few still held hope, but most understood the truth. This was the end of the road. As he turned away from the battlefield, his steps were steady, but slower than before. Not because he was weak, but because he was thinking. Every step carried the weight of everything that had happened, from the island to the return to this final moment. When he reached the place where his remaining officers waited, they stood in silence. No one spoke first. There was nothing simple to say. Finally, one of them stepped forward. "What now?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air. For a brief moment, no answer came. Then in a calm voice, he said, "It is over." The words were simple, but they carried a final truth. There would be no more plans, no more battles, no more attempts to take back control. This time, he chose to stop. The journey back was not like the one before. There was no growing crowd, no rising hope. Only a small group remained, moving carefully, quietly. The world outside was already reacting. News of the defeat spread quickly across Europe. Leaders who had been worried now felt relief. They had prepared for a long struggle, but now it seemed the answer had come faster than expected. Still, they did not want to take any risks. They knew what he was capable of. They would not allow another return. Back in the capital, the mood had changed completely. The same streets that once watched his return now felt uncertain again. People spoke in low voices. Some were disappointed. Others were simply tired of change. When he arrived, there was no celebration, only quiet understanding. He went inside, away from the public eye. The rooms that once felt full of purpose now felt empty. Not because they had changed, but because he had. He sat alone for a while, thinking, not about what he could still do, but about what he had already done. The victories, the mistakes, the choices, all of it. Soon, the pressure began again. Messages arrived. Voices from outside demanded a clear action. They wanted him gone, permanently this time. He understood. There was no space left to negotiate, no path left to fight. So he made one final decision. He would surrender, not in fear, but in acceptance. When the moment came, he presented himself calmly. There was no struggle, no resistance. He knew that continuing would only bring more harm, more loss. This was the only way forward. But even then, the question remained. Where would he go? The answer came quickly. This time, he would not be sent to a nearby island. Not somewhere close to the world he knew. He would be sent far away, very far, a place deep in the ocean, isolated and distant from everything, a place where escape would not be possible. The journey to that island was long and quiet. There were no secret plans now, no hidden hope of turning back. The sea stretched endlessly around him, and this time it did not feel like a path. It felt like a wall. When he finally arrived, the island looked small and lonely. Rocks, hills, and open land with very little around. This would be his new home, and his final one. Life there was simple. No armies, no crowds, no long meetings or urgent decisions. Just days passing slowly. At first, the change is difficult. The silence, the distance, the lack of movement. It was not easy for someone who had lived such a fast and powerful life. But over time, he adapted. He walked often, just as he had on the first island. But now, his thoughts were different. He no longer planned. He remembered. Sometimes, he spoke to the few people around him. He shared stories, not to impress, but to reflect. He talked about moments that had shaped his life, decisions that had changed everything. There was no need to hide anything now. Time moved slowly, but it kept moving. Seasons changed. Days passed into months, and months into years. The world outside continued without him. New leaders rose. New events took place. But his story remained. Even far away, people still spoke about him. They remembered the rise, the power, the fall, and most of all, the return. That bold escape from the island. That march without fear. That moment when everything seemed possible again. It became more than just history. It became a story people would tell again and again. Not just about power, but about belief, about a man who refused to accept the end when others decided it for him. In his final days, he grew quieter. His strength slowly faded, but his mind remained active. He still thought deeply, still reflected on everything he had lived through. One evening, as the sun set over the distant sea, he sat quietly, looking out at the horizon, the same horizon he had once crossed with hope. Now, it was simply something to watch, but there was no regret in his eyes, only understanding. He had lived a life few could even imagine. He had risen higher than most, fallen harder than many, and still found a way to rise again, if only for a short time. When his life finally came to an end, it was far from the world he once ruled. But his story did not end there. It continued in the minds of people, in books, in conversations, and in moments when someone faces a fall and wonders if they can stand again. Because his story was not just about winning or losing. It was about never accepting the idea that everything is over, even when the world believes it is. And that is why, long after he was gone, people still remembered one thing clearly. He escaped, he returned, and for a brief moment, he made the world believe in the impossible.